We have a special military operation right now, and it will be horrific. The Russians have made it clear that Ukraine will cease to exist as a modern nation state. This is because it's not a war. Second, the United States allows Ukraine to fire American-controlled, American-directed ATACMS missiles into Russian soil. Ukraine is still going to be able to rejoin as a modern nation state. But if Russia wanted to, they could literally flood the zone with thermal barracks, and there will be nothing alive.
In a moment of critical reflection, let's acknowledge that the Kremlin isn't often associated with miscalculated decisions. To revisit a pivotal moment from September, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin were actively engaged in high-stakes diplomacy. Secretary Blinken made a high-profile visit to Kyiv, meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Speculation was rife that this meeting would greenlight the deployment of advanced weapons systems. Meanwhile, Secretary Austin took a different tone during his meeting with Zelensky at Ramstein Air Base, firmly stating that the U.S. would not authorize such measures. The Pentagon's perspective was clear: escalating the conflict would not alter the strategic balance but could significantly heighten existential risks if events spiraled out of control. Since the outset, the Pentagon has consistently opposed such moves, reiterating its position even as the State Department pursued alternative approaches. Now, pivoting back to the political maneuvers, it's worth noting that the State Department sought to circumvent the Pentagon's objections. Enter Keir Starmer, who played a crucial role in advancing the diplomatic chess game. On Friday, September 13th, Starmer was invited to a White House meeting, coinciding with a notable announcement on September 12th that President Joe Biden would sign off on pivotal documents. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a measured yet unmistakable warning via a media briefing. He asserted that Russia was well aware of the operational intricacies of these weapons and emphasized that their deployment could not occur without the direct involvement of NATO powers. Putin cautioned that any use of such missiles against Russia would position these nations as direct participants in the conflict, necessitating an adjusted response from Moscow. This stark warning underscored the gravity of the situation. Despite this, diplomatic channels remained active, and Starmer's presence at the White House indicated a push to move forward. Meanwhile, the Russian ambassador to the United Nations delivered a stark address at a Security Council session, framing the potential missile deployment as a direct declaration of war. This rhetoric alarmed many within the international community. Yet the Biden administration, constrained by limited direct diplomatic communication with Moscow, sought alternative routes to gauge Russia's resolve. Relying on intermediaries with ties to the Kremlin, former U.S. officials reached out for clarity. Among them was Anatoly Antonov, a former Russian ambassador to the United States, serving as a critical link in assessing Moscow's intentions and potential reactions. These developments highlight the delicate balancing act on the international stage, where every decision carries profound consequences. Stay tuned as we continue to track this unfolding story with real-time updates and expert insights. In a moment that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, a stark warning emerged. The message was clear: if this escalates, it will indeed be a war. But what followed was even more chilling. The statement directly addressed U.S. assumptions, claiming that America believes the Atlantic Ocean can shield it from the fallout of a European conflict. The warning was unequivocal: this war, if ignited, would not remain confined to European borders. It would come to American soil, even reaching its major cities, and it would involve nuclear consequences. A vivid reminder: those who play with fire may very well get burned. The gravity of this message resonated deeply. President Biden, faced with these warnings, refrained from signing the document at the time. The Pentagon's stance was steadfast, emphasizing caution and the necessity to avoid triggering an uncontrollable conflict. Fast forward to today, and the situation remains unchanged in a critical sense. Russia's position has not shifted, nor has its nuclear posture. Importantly, it's not Russia seeking a nuclear war, but their strategy is clear: they remain ready to respond decisively if provoked. For some time now, Ukraine has been launching strikes using U.S.-supplied missiles against Russian targets, though these strikes have largely been confined to contested regions. The areas in focus include Donbas, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Crimea. For example, Ukraine has deployed Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles in these zones. A recent attack targeted the Kerch Strait bridge connecting Crimea, leaving it damaged by 2 Scalp missiles. These strikes exemplify Ukraine's tactical use of advanced weaponry to disrupt critical infrastructure. However, there's a broader message here that should resonate with Americans. These developments serve as a stark reminder that international conflicts can ripple far beyond their points of origin, potentially impacting nations that perceive themselves as insulated. Reflecting on the events of earlier this year, we are reminded how rapidly tensions can escalate, emphasizing the need for prudence in navigating these perilous times. Ukraine recently deployed an estimated 20,000 to 30,000 troops into the Kursk region. It's important to note that Kursk is not contested territory, it is undisputed Russian soil. This was, in essence, an invasion of Russia. But this wasn't just Ukraine acting alone. These forces were trained, equipped, and advised by NATO. The operation's blueprint was crafted and overseen by NATO, making this a NATO-coordinated incursion into Russia. To grasp the gravity of this, imagine if 20,000 or 30,000 cartel members from Mexico organized an incursion into U.S. states like California, Texas, or Arizona, occupying several counties. Americans wouldn't dismiss such an event. It would be seen as a clear act of war. Similarly, Russia views this situation with profound seriousness. While their response has been measured, avoiding mass troop diversions, they are steadily pushing back these invading forces. What's unfolding is also tied to U.S. politics. Reports suggest that the Biden administration is determined to ensure Ukrainian troops remain in Kursk by January 20th, potentially as part of a negotiating strategy that complicates any policy shifts under a new administration. However, Russia's methodical response is undermining this plan. Meanwhile, Ukraine has requested additional U.S. weaponry, including ATACMS missiles, arguing that such advanced systems could target deep Russian positions supporting the Kursk operation. They believe these weapons could secure their hold on the region. While some analysts disagree with this assessment, Ukraine's request raises the stakes dramatically. Approving such strikes would represent a direct U.S. role in attacks on Russian territory, reinforcing Moscow's claim that America, not just Ukraine, is waging war against them. The intricacies of these missile operations reveal the extent of U.S. involvement. Targeting for these missiles is handled by a specialized cell within U.S. intelligence, utilizing advanced geospatial data, radar mapping, and electronic intelligence. The process is meticulous. Routes are planned, encrypted guidance systems are programmed, and highly classified data is relayed to Ukrainian forces. However, the Ukrainians lack direct access to the cryptographic materials needed for these operations. That means every aspect of preparing these missiles, from targeting to encryption, requires American personnel. The missiles may be physically launched by Ukrainians, but Russia sees this as a clear attack by the United States, a perception that changes the game entirely. From Moscow's viewpoint, such an attack makes the U.S. an active participant in the conflict. The question now is how Russia would respond. According to a well-connected source, the decision on Russia's response is not something being debated or deliberated. It has already been made. Orders have been issued and key personnel are prepared. This isn't about a last-minute meeting in the Kremlin or frantic phone calls. The response plan is locked in, ready to execute if certain red lines are crossed. The calm and resolve of Russian leadership underscore the seriousness of their stance. As one senior figure in the Russian Senate, the head of their defense council, recently stated, these developments demand careful attention. The question for global leaders and observers alike is clear: what happens next if this escalation continues? Stay tuned as we follow this unfolding story with expert analysis and real-time updates. A stark and chilling warning has emerged from Moscow. Russian officials have stated unequivocally that if current escalations persist, Ukraine as a modern nation-state will cease to exist and Kyiv will be obliterated. Reports suggest that Russia plans to deploy a weapon of devastating capacity, one never before seen in modern warfare. Analysts point to a weapon known as the father of all bombs, a massive fuel-air explosive that uses aluminum powder as its fuel. This device would detonate above Kyiv, dispersing the powder over a wide area before igniting it, resulting in a catastrophic explosion. The overpressure alone would flatten entire city blocks, with estimates of hundreds of thousands of potential casualties. The implications are staggering. Bankova Street and the governmental heart of Kyiv would be completely destroyed, leaving the Ukrainian government in ruins. This, Russia signals, would be a decisive opening move, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape. In addition to the ongoing concerns within the conflict in Ukraine, some analysts are now suggesting that Russia could demonstrate its intentions beyond Ukraine's borders as a means of underscoring its resolve and sending a clear message to the West. While Moscow has repeatedly stated that it does not seek a direct nuclear confrontation with NATO, it has also made it clear that it perceives the current developments as dangerously close to crossing a critical red line. Experts note that the leadership in both the US and NATO is now facing increasing desperation, stemming from the belief that their strategy in Ukraine has been faltering. This perception of failure is compounded by the continued use of advanced U.S. supplied missiles, like the ATACMS, in attacks that have yet to provoke a significant response from Russia. As these attacks persist, there are growing concerns that NATO countries, particularly Poland, could take even bolder steps by expanding their air defense systems into western Ukraine. Such a shift, analysts warn, could mark a dramatic escalation, one that might involve NATO aircraft and ground forces actively operating within Ukraine's borders. If this were to happen, it could represent a decisive turning point in the conflict, potentially triggering a direct military confrontation between Russia and NATO forces. Such a scenario would bring the war into a new and far more dangerous phase, one that could have catastrophic consequences, both regionally and globally. In addition to the growing tensions, there is an increasing concern about the potential influx of NATO advisors into Ukraine. While initially these advisors might appear to be providing strategic and operational guidance, experts warn that there is a very real possibility that their presence could gradually evolve into something far more significant. What starts as a few advisors could quickly transform into entire battalions, and in turn, battalions could expand into brigades, ultimately resulting in NATO forces being deployed directly on the ground in Ukraine. This would, in effect, escalate the conflict to a whole new level, almost guaranteeing a prolonged and intensifying confrontation. As some analysts suggest, the ultimate goal for NATO appears to be to secure Ukraine as a full-fledged member of the alliance, regardless of the tremendous risks and the potential for further escalation involved. For these supporters, the argument is clear: they view Russia's invasion as a direct violation of international law, a fundamental assault on Ukrainian sovereignty, and a situation that warrants immediate and sustained global support. However, even among the most ardent supporters of Ukraine's cause, there is an acknowledgement that this conflict, while deeply concerning, does not pose an existential threat to U.S. national survival. As the situation progresses, the central and more critical question becomes: how far is the United States willing to go in escalating a conflict that increasingly carries the risk of nuclear consequences? How much longer can the U.S. afford to push for Ukraine's integration into NATO without crossing a threshold that could trigger an all-out war with Russia? These questions loom large as the situation continues to evolve, and the stakes continue to rise. Turning to domestic political dynamics, the conversation pivots to recent elections. The current administration, narrowly elected amid intense political division, faces unprecedented challenges. Observers note that former President Donald Trump was not expected to even be a candidate in this election. Legal battles and personal attacks aimed at disqualifying or discrediting him ultimately failed, culminating in a campaign that defied the odds. The attempted assassination in Butler, Pennsylvania, nearly ended his candidacy, but he survived, symbolizing for his supporters a triumph over extraordinary adversity. Starting from what many called an impossible position, his victory was seen by his base as an undeniable mandate. This election, as some commentators observe, has broken from traditional norms. Historically, U.S. elections reflect a duopoly, but the dynamics this time are distinct, with the electorate navigating deeply polarized choices in an era of unprecedented global and domestic uncertainty. As the country moves forward, the implications of this mandate, both for U.S. policy and its role on the global stage, are profound and far-reaching. Stay with us as we continue to unpack these critical developments. A growing and increasingly vocal sentiment among Americans points to a profound sense of frustration, particularly when it comes to the current state of U.S. politics. Many individuals across the political spectrum are beginning to feel that there is little to no real difference between the two major political parties, Democrats and Republicans, when it comes to the way the country is governed. The frustration stems from the belief that no matter which party holds power in the White House, there exists an unelected, deeply entrenched entity that continues to drive national policies with little regard for the will of the people or the political preferences of those in elected office. This powerful, shadowy structure, which has been referred to by various names such as the deep state, the interagency, or more colloquially, The blob operates largely behind the scenes, often maintaining continuity in policy, even when there is a change in political leadership. One clear example of this can be seen in the case of President Joe Biden's campaign promise to shift America's nuclear posture. Biden had pledged to change the U.S. nuclear strategy from one of preemption, meaning the U.S. could potentially use nuclear weapons first in a conflict, to a sole purpose doctrine, which would limit the use of nuclear weapons solely to responding to a nuclear attack. Despite this campaign promise, Biden found himself unable to bring about the necessary changes. When questioned about the failure to implement this shift, a senior official in the arms control community revealed that the interagency was not ready to make this adjustment. The issue here, critics argue, is that this interagency, this vast, unelected bureaucratic structure, operates outside the bounds of democratic accountability. The real question that many are asking is who voted for this interagency? How can it be that this shadowy, non-elected body holds so much power, effectively circumventing the authority of the elected commander-in-chief? In essence, critics contend that the interagency's unchecked influence undermines the democratic process, allowing a faceless bureaucracy to dictate policy, regardless of the will of the people or the mandates of elected officials. Former President Donald Trump entered the scene as a self-proclaimed disruptor, vowing to dismantle this entrenched system. If re-elected, Trump has plans to make sweeping changes, including appointing figures like Matt Gaetz as Attorney General to overhaul the Department of Justice and FBI, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to lead initiatives in public health. Trump intends to use legal mechanisms, such as the Vacancies Act, to bypass Senate opposition and install his picks for up to 480 days. This move would cement his revolutionary vision for government. Supporters argue this reflects the will of the people, who voted for Trump's transformative agenda, including a commitment to end the Ukraine conflict. Trump's rise also coincides with public frustration over U.S. involvement in Ukraine. Many Americans believe the conflict poses no direct threat to the nation's survival and see no justification for the Biden administration's deepening involvement. Voters have made it clear they want to wind down this conflict, but critics argue President Biden is pursuing an opposite course, attempting to tie Trump's hands ahead of his potential return to office. This strategy, some say, seeks to limit Trump's ability to chart a new course in foreign policy, particularly regarding Ukraine. President Trump's approach stands out because it's not rooted in traditional politics. Observers predict he will become increasingly vocal in response to the Biden administration's actions, which some see as laying landmines to obstruct his potential presidency. While the Biden administration emphasizes the importance of a smooth transfer of power, critics point to decisions being made that could undermine Trump's ability to pursue his agenda come January 20th. At the heart of this debate is the War Powers Act, a tool designed for emergencies where swift military action is required. Critics argue Biden's actions in Ukraine do not meet this threshold, calling it a war of choice that lacks public support. Not only is this approach seen as dangerous, but many view it as undemocratic, directly contradicting the will of the electorate. Trump, known for his combative style, is expected to take a more aggressive stance, signaling to Europe and the world that while he is not the president today, he will become January 20th. Stay with us as we follow these developments and explore what they mean for America's future at home and abroad. The situation at hand presents a stark and unmistakable warning. The proverbial light is red, and if actions continue as though it is green, severe consequences will inevitably follow. For many, the potential ramifications of ignoring this warning could be far-reaching, particularly when considering the prospect of a second term under former President Donald Trump. If re-elected, Trump's response to those who continue down the current path could be decisive and punishing. In the case of Ukraine, this could mean an absolute and total cutoff of U.S. aid, effectively leaving Ukraine to navigate its conflict with Russia without the substantial support it has come to rely on. For NATO, the situation could take an even more dramatic turn. Trump has previously hinted that he might dismantle the long-standing agreements that have governed the alliance for decades, including the pivotal Article 5, which obligates NATO member states to come to the defense of an ally under attack. If Trump were to refuse to invoke this article in the event of Russian aggression against countries like France and Great Britain, these nations would find themselves alone, left to confront Russian military threats without the collective defense that NATO has long provided. According to analysts, This approach is a clear reflection of Trump's revolutionary stance in international diplomacy. He does not operate within the traditional frameworks of foreign policy and military alliances. Rather, he believes he holds a direct mandate from the American people to implement bold and dramatic policy changes, regardless of the established norms or expectations. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden's actions, particularly in escalating tensions with both Russia and other global powers, are facing growing criticism. Some observers are not only questioning the democratic implications of his approach, but are also calling it reckless. These critics argue that Biden's policies and decisions are not just provocative, they are actively sabotaging the possibility of a smooth transition to a Trump administration, should he win re-election, while simultaneously taking significant risks by pushing the U.S. closer to potential conflict. Biden's insistence on continuing the current trajectory, they argue, is not only undermining future leadership possibilities, but also escalating the very tensions that could lead to catastrophic consequences. As the stakes continue to rise, this dynamic between the two administrations is raising more questions than answers about the future.